This is Jeff Shouse, pastor of First Baptist Church, Ramsey, Illinois. We are once again looking at the passage of Scripture, a history of the Bible. Where did it come from? How did we get this book that we all love and adore and cherish? Now we're going to look at the New Testament. What made it into the New Testament? What didn't make it into the New Testament, and why? New Testament canon is much more difficult to establish because it was international from the beginning. In the Old Testament, it was very localized. It was very contained within one group of people. And the New Testament, it was very all over the place. So you had people from all over the realms of the world who are writing and putting this together. And there's no real prophetic community there to write and receive and collect inspired books, to put them all in one place like they did in the Old Testament. So there was this great need for canon because an international church, you can imagine, they need to know which books or which letters should be translated into other languages for other cultures. They needed to know which books they should be reading and studying for doctrine and for living. And then you also had the persecution of Diocletian. He ordered the destruction by fire of the Scriptures. And so this would motivate the church to preserve the Scriptures. In fact, 25 years later, Emperor Constantine would call for a Bible to be made. And so they needed an official list, and they needed to be able to say, yeah, this is Scripture and this is not. And so from the very beginning of the New Testament, there are a plethora of books and letters that are being written claiming to be from God. However, there are also eyewitnesses to the life and the words of Jesus from the beginning. So if any of those teachings could not be verified by an eyewitness, then it was going to be rejected. And the apostles, who were the eyewitnesses, they became the final authority. And they would look at that and they would say, well, this is to be accepted and this isn't. This didn't happen and that did happen. And so they were the authority. Now, they would also have another test. And the other test was it being read aloud? Were there a public reading in their meeting times? The reading of Apostolic Letters was a continuation of a long prophetic tradition. This is something that we even see today. I know at First Baptist Ramsey, we have begun making this a part of our worship time in which there's no explanation, there's no interpretation, there's no application. It's just the simple reading of Scripture, and it has really brought a depth and life to our services. And it follows along this long-standing tradition of the New Testament of how they would do it as well. Also, the fact that these letters were circulated among the churches were more evidence of their inspiration. A letter would be given to the intended church, and then the subsequent church would make copies so that they could study it longer and be able to apply it to their lives. And so then they would begin collecting these letters, and all of a sudden they're coming up with a New Testament or a book of their own in which they could follow and they could use in order to more accurately and more faithfully follow Christ. So by the first century A.D., the 27 books which formed the New Testament had been widely recognized. Many of the early church leaders attested to this. And because we see a lot of the writings of the early church fathers, that we're talking about the second generation of the church fathers after the apostles, and they are quoting from the Gospels and from Acts and from Paul and from the other epistles and even from Revelation. And so we have over 36,000 quotations from these books by this second generation of church leaders. And so that really kind of informs us and helps us to know what was Scripture and what did they see as Scripture. But just because the early church leaders accepted it and cited it doesn't mean it was automatically included. There was still a great discussion on what should make the cut and what shouldn't. So just like the Old Testament that we looked at, there are some books in the New Testament which were accepted by all. There are some that were rejected by all. There were some that was questioned. And there are even some New Testament apocryphal books as well. Now, when we're talking about those that were accepted by all, 20 out of the 27 books of the New Testament were instantly accepted and really largely never disputed. They took them, they received them. It was immediately a part of who they were. Now, there are almost 24 books that we know of that were rejected soundly by the early church. Now, most of these books contain the heretical teachings of the Gnostics, the Docetics, and the Ascetics. Now, the Gnostics, they were people who said they had a special knowledge into the divine mysteries of God. They also believed that all matter, the physical nature is evil, and they denied the incarnation of Christ. They said that he was human, he wasn't divine, that he was just a man. Then you had the Docetics, and the Docetics believed that Jesus was divine, but he wasn't human. They were just the opposite of the Gnostics. And so Jesus was fully God on this earth, but he wasn't man. He couldn't be defiled by the skin of humanity. Then you had the Aesthetics, and the Aesthetics said that Jesus was a fusion, that he was 50% God and 50% man, that there was this fusion of God and man brought together. Now, the scriptures clearly talks about the fact that Jesus was fully God and fully man at the same time. And so if you had any of these ideas that would go against that, then they would not be accepted as scripture. We reject these books a lot of times because we don't really know who wrote them. So some of them claim to have authorship of this person, and really the book was written long after that person had died. So false claims about authorship. False claims about Jesus' childhood miracles. There's one book that was supposedly written by Thomas that talks about him as a boy. He finds this dead bird and he brings life back to this bird, and it's just never... It just doesn't pass the smell test, really, when we talk about those things. They give false claims about biblical events. They just get it wrong. False teachings that don't match up with, especially with Paul. They deny the deity of Christ with some of them. The early church leaders rejected them, so we reject them. And a lot of the modern experts reject them as well because there are just too many questions about them. So that brings us to a whole nother set of books that were questioned. There are 7 books that were questioned early on. Ultimately, they made it in Scripture. First of all, you had the book of Hebrews. It is truly anonymous on who wrote the book of Hebrews. And so because of that, the apostolic authority was questioned as well. Ultimately, it was accepted. James, there was a question about James. First of all, the question was it the brother of Jesus that wrote the book? But his identity was firmly established later on. And then they misunderstood his teaching about salvation and works. James is not saying we're saved by works. He is saying that works confirm our faith. And so once they were able to talk about that and figure that out, they accepted it. Then you have 2 Peter. The difference in style from 1 Peter and the topics that it discussed really gave pause for its inclusion. However, it is very similar to Peter's speeches in Acts 2, Acts 3, Acts 10, Acts 15, and because of that, they accepted it. 2nd and 3rd John were questioned because they are very, very personal in nature. And it was not passed around a lot. It was very limited in its circulation. But there's a man called Polycarp, and Polycarp was a direct disciple of John, and he vouched for its authenticity. And so because of Polycarp's testimony, because of his verification of it, they accepted it as scripture. You had the book of Jude. Its authorship was questioned, and the fact that he references another book called the Book of Enoch and alludes to a second book called The Assumption of Moses. Really, people were saying, I'm not too sure about this. But the earliest church leaders talked about it, and they vouched for it, and so it was included. And then you had the book of Revelation. Now, ironically, Revelation was the very first book to be widely accepted as canon. But when it came to the 4th century, all of a sudden church leaders started looking at it and said, I'm not too sure about this. But then you had Augustine and Jerome and many others who would come to its defense, great scholars. They would come to its defense, and then once again it was accepted as canon. And then you do have some New Testament apocryphal books. Now, there's a difference between the Catholic Orthodox Apocrypha and the New Testament Apocrypha. The New Testament Apocrypha never really gained the acceptance that the Old Testament Apocrypha did. It was very localized in its use and really only accepted by a small group of believers. And so this is how we got our New Testament. So you have been listening to the passage of Scripture